Hey YouTube, Do-It-Yourself Junkie 369 here, and today, as part of my RV10 build series, I'm doing a primer test. Now, none of these are primers that you buy from aircraft supply stores, and part of that is, if you go to one of those, usually it's online, you make the purchase, and then on top of the cost of the primer, which is usually pretty high, and shipping, you need to pay a hazmat fee to go with that shipping, because it is hazmat. So I just went around to local stores and picked up what was available to me. I tried to get self-etching primer to make it kind of a fair comparison. So I have a Rust-oleum self-etching primer, Dupli-Color self-etching primer, and I'll tell you the price on these later after we see which one's better. Although I will say I had to buy them at completely different stores, and I think that impacted some of the price. Then I have a favorite that was mentioned on Van's Aircraft quite a bit, which is this Technique self-etching primer 7220 from NAPA. And everybody that goes with the spray can primers seemed to like that or another one that is available from an aircraft supply store. And then this one, I don't know if it's a self-etching primer. I read everywhere, tried to find out what exactly it was, but it's supposed to be for tractors. And I think I know of one guy that painted their airplane using this style of paint, and they really like the results and the colors. It's John Deere green. So I picked this up. It's available at Roll King or Tractor Supply Store. I think both carry it. So it's kind of the unknown in this test, and mainly I wanted 4 contestants. So each of these are going to get 2 aluminum tags each, and the tags are 2 inches by 3 inches, and they're going to be cleaned with alcohol and then painted with a light thin coat. We're trying to keep the weight increase under 1%, which my scale won't even read that low. I don't think it will anyway. So it might, it's more of an eyeball thing. Like the primer coat on an airplane, at least for parts that aren't getting painted, when you coat everything, all the aluminum components, should be almost translucent. So each one of those will get painted, probably just one surface. That way you can kind of see a control on the back surface, because one of these tags is going to be sent through a corrosion test where I expose it to salt water. And it won't be in the salt water, but I'm going to put it on a tray above the salt water and then keep the heat at about 35 degrees Celsius. And then the other tag is going to get painted and then have a piece of Gorilla Tape adhered to it. And that's going to set for a while, and then I'm going to try to peel the Gorilla Tape off and see how much paint it takes off. Kind of an adhesion test. So basically, first we'll prep the aluminum with the alcohol and then spray each one with the paint and then let it dry for 24 hours. And they're going to be setting side by side, so all the conditions are identical as I can make them. So we'll get started. Just spraying it. Dupli-Color is the first one that has sprayed like professional aircraft primer, I would expect. It came out real watery and real thin. The others were quite a bit thicker. I couldn't really get it as thin as I'd like on the part. Where this is, I had to spray it a little bit extra just to make sure I was getting the correct coverage. So far, this is the first stuff that's acted like primer that I've used on helicopters in the past. Okay, so the parts have been drying for 24 hours. I've already labeled the back of each one. So A, B, C, and D. And those marks correspond to marks on the bottom of each can. That way I can keep track of which primer is which. As far as coverage, A here is fairly light. I don't know if I can get a good light on it, but it's fairly light. It looks almost like there's not enough primer on there, although it's pretty good. And it's a lot easier to see it on this version where that primer almost looks like it's too light of a coat. That is what I'm going for. You don't want to add a whole lot of weight and make this primer coating too thick. And so that, to me, from what I'm used to seeing, that's about perfect coverage. A little bit heavy down in here and right across here. This one is fairly light in the same manner. This one to me seems too heavy, and this one is just really heavy. Like that looks like I painted the thing to where you can't see through it at all. And I didn't spray these two pieces these two samples any more than these two samples. It's just how the primer is set up coming out of the can. And so it was really easy to get a real light coat on these, and then a quick spray with these seemed to come out too heavy. But we'll see how they hold up during testing. So that's the next step, is to take one sample and we'll put those in salt fog, and then we'll take these samples and put a piece of Gorilla Tape on them, and that's basically the adhesion test. So when that Gorilla Tape sits and has a good chance to bond to the primer, when we peel the Gorilla Tape off later, we'll see how much of the primer is stripped off of the metal, and that should give us a fairly good comparison on how good the adhesion is between these different primers. So each piece just gets a piece of tape on it, and then it'll sit for 24 hours at room temperature. That should give us some pretty good adhesion. And for you guys that have never used this tape, it kind of just looks like black duct tape, but whatever adhesive they use for this tape, like if I stuck a piece on this wood and let it set up really good, when I went to peel the tape off, it actually peeled chunks out of the wood. So it's got some crazy holding strength, which I'm pretty sure this company developed the glue first. And I've used their glue for a quick and dirty boat build, and it sets up quick enough for that, because we were given about 8 hours to do the build, if I remember right. Might have been 12, but basically anything we need to glue, we glued right as the clock started. That way it had an adequate time to set up, and it also expands and is a foam, so the seams of the boat were watertight. So the glue was expensive and accounted for a good chunk of the price of our boat, which was limited to $100. But at the same time, we didn't have to spend any money on anything else trying to get the boat waterproof. So there's our tape on each sample. I've pressed it down flat, no air bubbles. Tried to be equal on all pieces. And I'll probably just tuck these ends under, that way I have something to grab onto when I go to pull the tape off. And we'll let that sit for 24 hours and then come back, peel it off, and see whether or not it leaves any primer on the samples. I think this is a pretty tough test, and we might end up with no primer on any of the samples, especially since I didn't do any other prep other than alcohol. So that means these are hard, shiny, glossy surfaces, and even though these are self-etching primers, I didn't do any sort of scuffing to promote additional adhesion. The other test will be salt fog. Basically, I'm going to put these suspended above a water source that has 3.5% salt concentration, and I'm going to keep that water at 35°C, which is just under 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So not boiling, but it is going to produce steam, and I'm going to keep a lid on that pot. So these aren't sitting in water getting heated, but they're sitting just above it with that salt fog or salt humidity air, salt humid air in the circulating inside that pot. Hopefully I don't end up ruining the pot when I do this. But it'll be really interesting to see if after 24 hours, I might let these dry for 24 hours and just sit out. So we're looking at 3 days here to do this test. But I'll pull those out after 24 hours, then let them sit and dry and get a chance I won't wipe them off or clean them or anything, and give a chance for any sort of corrosion to hopefully set in. And hopefully with that concentration and temperature, if these are going to corrode, it'll show up quicker than actually sitting out on a coastal area. So I'll go get that set up, and then we'll come back when we're ready to look at the results, and we'll see how these 4 compared. Okay, so these are the adhesion test pieces, and in a second I'll flip each one over and peel the Gorilla Tape off so we get a good look at how well the primer adhered to the test sample. The other pieces were the ones that went in the saltwater environment, and basically they were at just above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for a 24-hour period, and now that they've been brought out of that salt humid environment. First off, here's a picture of them sitting. Basically I stuck them in a crock pot full of salt water that was 3.5% salt concentration. There's a cut on my finger. I just reached in there and now it's burning because of the salt water that got in it. And I just pulled those out because they'd been in there for 24 hours, and now they have to sit and dry for 24 hours and give a chance for any salt water condensation on them to crystallize, give it a good chance to start corroding. If it's going to corrode, we're probably going to see something at the end of that 24-hour period, and then we'll get an idea of how well the sample stood up to that environment. So we'll just start with A, and there we go. And you can see it did peel some of that off. The trick will be doing a comparison and maybe coming up with a percentage number that equates to that area that's now missing primer. And now time for B. And at this point I can't even remember which primer is on which sample. So I honestly have no idea how or which one is performing the best, other than, I mean, so far it's pretty obvious that B, whichever primer that was, had really great adhesion. That's barely anything came off on that one. And all of these got the same treatment. None of them were scuffed up. They just were rubbed with alcohol to get rid of any waxes or oils. All painted under the same conditions. Wow. C obviously is our worst performer so far. That's pretty crazy. Well, also a crazy part here to note is part of the adhesive of the tape is permanently stuck to this sample. I guess I could try to peel it off, but I might accidentally scrape some of the primer off. But that was a pretty horrible adhesion. My battery's about to die, so I better hurry up. And we'll strip the tape off of D here. Man. D looks about like B. I mean, there's a little bit up here around the edges where I started peeling the tape, but that's going to happen really just because there's nothing, that's a pretty sharp edge there. And there's nothing really for the paint to adhere onto when you're trying to peel against the edge of the paint with that tape there. So that's kind of what I expected to happen on all of them, no matter how good the adhesion is. So if I'd have to say, this is probably a tie between B and D, followed by A and C being the worst. But in all fairness, that was a really tough test. I'm actually surprised these two did as well as they did. I was expecting all of them to look like this, and maybe all except for one to look like this, or worse, have no primer left on them at all. I mean, this is the tape that I was saying, if I put it on this plywood, it actually ripped chunks out of the plywood when I pulled it up later. So really impressed with these two. Fairly impressed with this one. Kind of, even though this is what I was expecting, I'm a little disappointed in this one, but not too much because this is kind of the result I was expecting on all of them. So we'll let the pieces that were in the salt environment dry, and then we'll take a look at those next and see how they did and whether or not those come out in a different order, or if they even have any corrosion on them at all. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. That might be a non-factor during this test, and price and adhesion might be the only two factors that you need to consider when looking at these. Okay, so here's my samples after I put them in the salt bath. It wasn't really a bath, it was more like a salt sauna. So you saw a picture of it, and basically every 15 minutes or so I'd take the lid off and baster some salt water onto these samples, and you can see the salt crystallized on the metal. I don't know if it caused any corrosion. We'll have to find out. And there is some salt crystals on the front. And some of this primer is missing, but that's where I drove the sample into that block of wood. So, I mean, the primer's not going to stay on for that. So, there's the samples. Looks like any salt that's on there, I can just wipe it off, and there's really not any thing going on with the primer coat. And same thing with the back. That salt was just crystallized on there. I wiped it off. There's nothing. And there's probably a protective coat on here if I had to guess, kind of like Alclad, where it's pure aluminum clad. If I look at the cross section here where I sawed it, there appears to be some corrosion there. So sample C here, wiping it off. I don't know if you can see it on the video. maybe if I tilt it, I wiped the salt off, and there is definitely something going on with the primer coating there, where even though the salt is gone, you can still see something has occurred. So it seems to be doing not so great compared to the others. And it's actually like eating away at the coat. When you rub your finger across it, you can feel it. Nothing quite like that on the other samples. Yep. So I guess rating wise for this test, A, B, and D are going to be equal, and C is going to be the loser out of this one on the salt or weather exposure. So that's the end of the test. I'll talk about the results here before I end the video, but that's it. So here are the results plugged into an Excel spreadsheet. I have the price as well as the name of each at the top, and then what samples they ended up being. And I actually forgot which was which during the test. I thought C was the NAPA 7220, and I thought the Majic was D. So completely messed that up, which was good because the whole reason of making them A, B, and C, and D is I didn't remember which was which, and I wasn't trying to skew the results in any way. And then I've ranked them for price, 1 through 4, 4 being the best. So at the end, when I total the scores, whichever one scores the most is the one that I'm going to go with. And then coverage, that is the appearance of the primer as it covers the piece. So the thinner it appears, the better in this case. So the Rust-oleum was that real thin one, or the Dupli-Color was that real thin one that got ranked as a 4, and the NAPA was fairly thin. Remember, on the Dupli-Color, that was the one that I said that looked like primer on aircraft that I was used to seeing. So that's basically how those went. And then the two heavy coated ones were obviously the Majic and the Rust-oleum. Then adhesion and corrosion are self-explanatory. The more that it ripped off during the adhesion test, the lower it scored. Corrosion, they were pretty much all the same. And where there was a tie, both of them would have ranked a 4, but then because 3 were the top, tied for the top, the next number down has to be a 1 for the Dupli-Color, which that one wasn't so bad during corrosion, but it did have some obvious indentations left from the salt that I wiped off the material. And then for the weighted results, I took the numbers up in those blocks and multiplied them by a certain percentage out of the total score. So the price is worth 30% of the total score. The coverage is only worth 20% of the total score. And then I made adhesion and corrosion both worth 25% because in my mind, they're kind of equal. And I determine these weights before I go and calculate the results. That way, I'm not adjusting the weights on any of that stuff to skew the results in a direction that I want them. So I had determined those weights beforehand, and to me, price was fairly important, but I didn't want it so large that it overpowered the other results because everything to me was almost equal on this test, equally important. And so that puts the results down there. As you can see, total score, the Majic and Rust-oleum are tied, but when you look at the weighted results because of the lower price, Rust-oleum is just a hair better, despite its coverage almost being too thick. Okay, so that's the end of the primer test. Based on price and performance, I would go either with this Majic Town & Country, which is made for tractors and other farm implements, or the Rust, and I don't know if this one's self-etching. So it was just the one I found, and I wanted a fourth contestant in this, and I wasn't expecting great things out of it. but it seemed to do really well. It does seem to go on kind of the thick side. It seems a little bit thicker than the others. Best bang for your buck, I think, is going to be the Rust-oleum self-etching primer. That one I would say is equal to the Majic, except for I know it's self-etching and the price is about equal. So hope you liked the video, hope it was informative. I'm going to take these samples that I put in the salt, I'm going to lay them outside just on the pavement, in the rain, in the sun, and leave them out there and see how long it takes one of them to degrade. But I have to end the video before I do that, because that's going to, they could be out there for years, who knows, without any issue. And so, I mean, I will do a follow-up video to this at some point covering that. That way it doesn't get lost in one of my other videos. I'll make it separate. But hope you liked the video. Please hit that thumbs up. Please subscribe to see more stuff like this. I like doing testing videos. Those and reviews are one of my favorite videos to do, because I feel like I'm helping people out more than just building an airplane, which, I mean, it's fun to watch, but unless you make that leap into building an airplane, the stuff I'm covering might not necessarily help you in your day-to-day life, where this might help you if you're painting a car or patio furniture, or I don't know, some other metal project that you decide that needs painted, especially if it's aluminum. Bicycle, there we go. And so I love doing those. If you got any questions, comments, feel free to share them. I might cover them in the follow-on video if it's something I can talk about by the time that rolls around. Since that might be a while out, I'll make sure to answer questions in the comments. And please subscribe if I didn't say all that already. And thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video.